Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our session on careers and opportunities and challenges. We're really very lucky to have with us four distinguished speakers, two whose names are well known to you because they've been active in the field and in an entrepreneurial as well as in a substantive way, and then two of our own who graduated in the last several years and who have found themselves at least temporary employment. Not because they're going to be fired, but because they may choose to go somewhere else. But in any case, it's a great pleasure to see you and a great pleasure to welcome them. Let me, in reverse order, introduce them, although they can certainly supplement my introduction in any way that they wish. Sitting immediately to my left is Eli Lovely, graduate from our program about a year and a half ago. He's been working at Kroll and Associates. And he'll give you, I don't want to say a jaundiced view, but a realistic view of what employment means. You might conclude after his presentation, at least from what he's told me, that unemployment might be better than employment? Question mark. I doubt that very seriously. Farther down the table, Andrea Murta, a former journalist, also a graduate of our program, who works at PricewaterhouseCoopers on corruption. Question.
Anti-corruption.
Anti-corruption.
That's an important
And since there's plenty of corruption, she's gainfully employed and can be for, I suspect, for a long time. Eric Burnland, you all know, has been teaching in our program for a long time and is the president of Democracy International, which is a far-flung empire that focuses on a variety of things, all of them related to democracy and governance. And then finally, farthest to the left than the first speaker, Don Planty, ambassador, former ambassador to Guatemala, and who had a long and distinguished career in the State Department. Our paths intersected 25 years ago. It's horrible when you can say several decades. At least one can smile about it. But in any case, it's great to have him here. And he has most recently been working on questions related to governance, conflict resolution, with a specific focus on Syria. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to take perhaps 10 minutes and to give us from their respective sides what the field, certainly from Don and from Eric, what the prospects for the field not only of study but of work are. And from the point of view of Andrea and Eli, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? Perhaps some advice on how you can try and develop your career path in a way that's satisfactory and relatively safe. Although those may be oxymoronic. But in any case, let me turn over and thank you very much, Don, for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you, Sam. I'm glad to be here. It's great to see you again. Brings back fond memories of days gone by in Spain, which is always a nice place to be. And I appreciate the opportunity. Are all of you students in the Walsh School of Foreign Service? You spread around. You're all focused on international affairs?
On democracy and governance in particular,
and
and their students in the MA in democracy and governance, of which, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm co-director of it along with Dan Bremberg. And this MA is part not of the School of Foreign Service, although we are sitting in one of the spaces of the School of Foreign Service, but of the Department of Government, Political Science.
All right, well, I would say to begin in the field of democracy and governance, there are rich opportunities, both financially and richly rewarding in terms of substance. So I urge you to stay in the field and learn as much as you can about it while you're in school. All you have to do is look around the world casually and see what's going on, and you will see writ large serious governance issues in every region of the world. There isn't a region exempt from that. Serious democracy issues in every region of the world. There isn't a region exempt from that. I taught for a couple of years at the Maxwell School of Public Policy of Syracuse University. I was chair of the International Relations Department there, and I used to challenge my students to name me one issue, one public policy issue that did not have an international dimension, and two, that was not a democracy or governance issue. And I'm still waiting. So there's a crying need for people who have expertise to do this work. I think, unfortunately, today, what I see, and I do it because there is life after the Foreign Service. Professor Mouhaleon mentioned I was in the Foreign Service. I hesitate to say this too, but I was in for 30 years. I came in at the lowest rung of the ladder as an FSO 7 earning $11,347 a year, and managed to crawl my way up the greasy pole, as I said, to the top job. So for those of you who are interested in Foreign Service, that can be done. I came in by competitive examination and was a career officer who rose to the top through a lot of good fortune and good assignments, but also because I had prepared for that particular career, just as you're preparing to work in the fields of democracy and governance. I'd always been interested in international affairs, and so both of my degrees, undergraduate and graduate degrees, were in international relations, and I spent a year on a Fulbright at the Universidad Católica de Chile, the Catholic University of Chile, and I had always aspired to a career in the Foreign Service, so I was able to accomplish that. But even if it's not Foreign Service, and I'm also living proof that there's life after a career. Let's say you spend 30 years, God forbid, at PricewaterhouseCoopers or some other such organization, whatever you're working in, and you decide you want a second career because of the work you will have done. If it's focused in this area, you'll find there's still work to be done. I've been out of the Foreign Service almost 15 years now, and the work I've done over that period has been just as interesting, if not more interesting in some respects, than it was in the service. So while I'm retired from the Foreign Service, I'm not retired from active engagement on international issues, and most of the time it's in the governance and democracy area. I'll just say one more word and stop so I don't go over I'm into 6 minutes of the 10 already. I do, as Professor Mouhaleon mentioned, I currently have a project working with the Syrian opposition. All last year it was with the political side of the opposition. We met in Berlin once a month to educate them a bit about, and they view themselves as the government in waiting if and when Assad disappears from the scene, and there can be a pluralistic democratic government in Syria. That's what these folks have in mind. There are about 50 Syrian leaders from all walks of life. And they have a hard time agreeing on anything, but they were new to how they, both thinking about how they would govern and how to construct a democracy. We really had to start from ground zero. And so it was a lot of tough work. This past year I've been continue to work with some of the senior commanders of the Free Syrian Army when we bring out of Syria and out of the conflict at certain times into Turkey, and talk to them about also these issues, but more particularly about how to interface with the civilian population they control. So it's really civil-military relations, civilian security, citizen security, this sort of thing. I had a project that we were discussing a minute ago in South Sudan, which is also a democracy governance project that I had to suspend when the attempted coup and then the fighting came out. I've also worked in Egypt. I've worked, obviously, as you might think, in Guatemala, and extensively in Latin America, and I've had numerous other projects that fall into this category. So I would say you're in a very necessary field, rich opportunities, but very, very important that we have people entering, working on these themes, on these issues, who know something about them, who've done some academic preparation. I know U.S. government institutions that have serious responsibilities for international affairs and for governance and democracy issues these days that are hiring bank tellers because they're not getting the right people coming to them and saying, I would like to work with you. So I congratulate you for your interest. I urge you to keep on it. I think these issues aren't going away, and I'd be happy to answer any questions later if I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, would you care to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Maldian, for inviting me to do this. As I was thinking about my career and what I could say that might be useful or interesting to you all, I realized that I've worked in a private law firm, in a big law firm. I've worked in higher education, in higher education administration, and also had an adjunct relationship with your program for a few years. I've worked at an NGO. And now I work at a private consulting firm. I've also spent summer jobs in government. Also had a summer job as a lifeguard, but that's probably not as helpful or relevant. But so I've seen this field from a few different places, which I think is useful. I like to think of I think democracy and governance as a subfield of development is still very young. It's really at most 25 to 30 years old as a serious subfield of international development. Before that, nobody thought of democracy promotion as international development or something practical or specific. It was more about government-to-government relations and government, high-level government policy and rhetoric. But starting about 30 years ago, we began a kind of almost accidental sort of trial and error process that led to a subfield emerging that you all are studying and you all know more about than most people. And I think it's worth remembering that it's young. I've been working in it for about 25 years. Of those 25 to 30 years, I'll just tell you really quickly who I am. It's a little bit idiosyncratic. I don't think it provides a model for somebody else's career path, but it kind of will tell you where I'm coming from and maybe spark some thoughts. I got interested in international development in college, and while I was also very interested in anti-apartheid movement related to South Africa. I went to college in the 1970s, and that was politically salient on campus and something that motivated a lot of people and certainly got my attention. And I continued to be interested in that after I had finished law school. I went to law school at Columbia and went to work for a big law firm, but had the opportunity to do pro bono projects on human rights cases, particularly in Haiti and in Namibia, which was then called Southwest Africa. And that really was really fun. That was really what I was interested in doing. And because I had that experience, I spent time in Namibia, which was then controlled illegally by South Africa, illegally under international law, but controlled in fact. I wrote an academic article about that, and I got involved in, as I said, in cases there, and I parlayed that into an introduction to what was then a relatively new organization called the National Democratic Institute, NDI. I ended up going to work there initially to help with the Namibia project, as Namibia was in a transition to independence in 1989, and I stayed there for what became 11 years. Worked in different places around the world, including long periods overseas in Africa, Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, and Indonesia, among other places. It was great. It was great being at a part of an organization that was kind of inventing a field. In the early days, had a little bit of resources, a little bit of freedom to operate, and a lot of very creative people to kind of think about what to do with it. And I think, in a lot of ways, this field that you're studying is, only dates to those days. I left there in 2000. I went to work at the Wilson Center for about a year and a half as a fellow to sort of do more think tank stuff. And I wrote a book about election monitoring as a kind of way of thinking about democracy promotion. And coming out of that with another colleague, as part of a conversation with a number of people, but with one colleague in particular, we started an organization that we called Democracy International. We formally started that in 2003, and our goal was to sort of help this field be better. We thought that there was a need for better analytical work and understanding what democracy and governance programs were about, and how they could be useful, and what lessons should be learned. And we thought there was an opportunity to do that. In conversations with friends at AID and elsewhere, we thought that there was a need for it. Kind of somebody between academics on the one hand and practitioners as we were on the other, people who were able to be independent enough of ongoing programs to be able to evaluate them and do assessments and things like that. And we basically had success in doing that, and we continue to do that to this day. We've grown a lot in doing kind of analytical work in the democracy and governance field since we named Democracy, Rights, and Governance, at least by USAID. We also never sort of stopped doing the kind of practical implementation of democracy and governance programs, and particularly related to election monitoring and election advice and political processes issues, but also broader than that. And we did it in the early days of Democracy International. We did it with our friends at MDI and the Carter Center and the Asia Foundation, more as consultants to them. But then after a few years, we started doing projects as Democracy International that were long-term implementation projects or election observation projects and the like, which has been not what we originally intended. We didn't originally intend to sort of do the same kind of work that we've been doing. We wanted to be more analytical, but we ended up being kind of both. So as I said, the field is still young. You know, it's still evolving, as I think you know. But in the 1980s was really where it came from. Maybe you might say the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy was a kind of a major starting point. But it didn't really become institutionalized until the 1990s. But in the 1990s, USAID, which is the place that has all the money, as you know, started thinking of democracy and governance as its own field, and started that as a career path, and started funding projects, and increasingly there was the establishment of what Tom Melia, who's had an association with this program called the Democracy Bureaucracy within the U.S. government. So both good and bad, and in a way the institutionalization of a democracy and governance program at Georgetown is part of the professionalization of the field and the institutionalization of the field. There's the democracy and governance as a subfield kind of was in the right place at the right time, also because the world was changing. So it was more of a going along with that wave rather than a cause of it. But it was an opportunity for the creative organizations and for government funding following that to kind of look for opportunities to make a difference in the world, with really significant changes in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union starting in 1989-90, and really dramatic changes in Latin America and Asia and parts of Africa. So there was a big growth in the scale of these projects through the 1990s, more and more money for it. In the 2000s, the public perception of it and even the policymaker perception of it, I think, changed as it became associated with Iraq misadventures, and also as a lot of the money, the budgets for democracy and governance really in a lot of ways exploded, but there's a semantics issue because a lot of that money was for so-called critical priority countries, and particularly for Iraq and Afghanistan. So there were, whether we think of those as what we had previously thought of as democracy and governance programs or not, that's where a lot of the money went and a lot of the new focus. And there was also at the same time kind of an international development generally, but also in the DG field, a kind of proliferation of organizations even within the government. So USAID, not only USAID grow in its support for the field, but also there were new government entities. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is kind of at least adjacent to democracy and governance, was invented by the Bush administration with a little bit different idea about what development projects should look like, and MAPI, the Middle East Partnership Initiative within the State Department, that was doing essentially democracy and governance programs, and of course you still had the National Endowment for Democracy and a lot of NGOs doing programs with U.S. government money, and DRL, the Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor in the State Department, which previously had been more of a policy and kind of internal advocacy bureau, became increasingly operational, actually doing grants and funding programs. So you had this kind of proliferation of stuff, and that had some negative consequences, and has caused a lot of kind of at least difficulties, if not dysfunctions, within the U.S. government. I guess since our time is limited in the initial comments, I'll sort of skip ahead to say sort of USAID has struggled with this, and the latest iteration struggled with a lot of issues that, and tried to change the way it does things with the USAID Forward agenda, which is, among other things, working more with local partner organizations and things like that. But also there's a new democracy, human rights, and governance strategy, which I hope you are aware of because you're focused on this field, which somewhat waters down democracy and governance programs. It's an attempt to try to make it more intellectually consistent so that what the authors of the strategy would say is that they're trying to focus more on why the U.S. government supports these programs rather than what it does or how, before it was sort of what kind of programs the government funded, but they're trying to say why we're doing it. But in a way, what it's really done is it's kind of recognized the reality that budgets have begun to go down for democracy and governance. And there's 4 objectives, one of which is the new objective of adding human rights to the democracy and governance agenda, and one of which is making a virtue of necessity, I think, which is integration of democracy and governance and human rights into other development programs, which is something that I think all of us can agree is a good idea, but as a practical matter, it's not a good sign that the budgets are waning for democracy and governance programs. So that's kind of where we are with USAID. There's a lot of sturm and drang within our community about sort of how programs are funded as between consulting firms and nonprofit NGOs and grants and cooperative grants on one hand and contracts on the other, much of which is more about who gets the resources than about anything substantive. I wanted just to, I think there are real career opportunities, in diverse organizations. I think, as Ambassador pointed out, there's working for government, including the Foreign Service, the State Department, and USAID, or elsewhere in government. There are lots of non-government organizations of different flavors and sizes and mandates that are doing things that you all care about and would be interested in. There's private sector organizations and consulting firms, and I think multilateral organizations. I think we're all part of a kind of emerging field, and we're part of the professionalization of that field, and that's a good thing. And because you all have thought about that and have expertise to bring to it, I think that puts you in a good position to be valuable to many of those organizations. And these issues, as has been said, will continue to be salient. The last thing I'll say right now is in terms of what you can do to make yourself marketable, and I think that might be part of the discussion you all will pick up on. There's a few things I would mention. One I just said, which is actual substantive knowledge of the field, because it is being thought of now as a field. There are things that that you can learn and that you know that are valuable to work in the field that not everybody's aware of, just the history of it and some of the practical and professional things that can be done to advise counterparts and clients in other countries is important. The commitment to the values that are behind democracy is a universal value. Obviously, that's important. In terms of being marketable to employers, it's obviously going to be valuable if you have international experience, and that shows a commitment to the values. And of course, foreign languages, certain foreign languages in particular, are going to be valuable. But the single most important thing that we look for when we hire people, and that I think will make a difference in sort of how successful you are in your career, is the ability to write clearly, to sort of think analytically and clearly, and to be able to write it well. Because the number of people that work in the world that are well credentialed and smart people, but that can't communicate well in English and write it down is astounding. And everything, in most of the things, certainly in our work and most of the work I'm familiar with, writing is just extremely important. Writing proposals, writing reports, writing internal communications. So to the extent that you can show that you can write well, I think you'll help yourself. I'll stop there.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks very much.
Well, I second everything that Eric just said. Because I was just very recently looking for a job myself, and it's absolutely true that skills that employers are looking for have to do with obviously knowledge of the field and also international experience, foreign languages, and the ability to write. well in English, and in other languages if you can as well, but obviously in English primarily. I think it's interesting that both me and Eli were invited to this panel because, at least to my experience, I could be wrong, but when I was in the program, there were basically no other students who were working in the private sector. Most of graduates went to NGOs or government or something that's not the for-profit organizations of this world to such an extent, maybe, as the firms that we are working for right now. And I'm twice an outlier, I think, because I'm a foreigner, as you can probably tell, and I don't have U.S. citizenship. I needed a visa, and we usually think, I don't know, are there many other foreigners here today? Foreigners? A few. Okay, we usually think that American companies are not going to hire you unless you already have a visa, and, well, I'm proof that you can have it. So my background, I came from Brazil to the US in 2008. I went to New York first and then DC as an international correspondent for a newspaper that I worked for in Brazil. And in 2011, when it was time for me to go back, my rotation was over, I decided that I had it with journalism. Print journalism was not exactly a booming industry, and I should try to find something else to do with my life. So I came to Georgetown and I did my master's here in the D&G program, which was absolutely great. It was everything I expected. I needed some sort of the political background, the political studies that I didn't have as a journalist, because honestly we have a lot of, the journalists are specialists in everything and nothing, right? So I needed to stop and actually get the political theory back in place. But it also has a lot of the practice mingled into it. For example, with Eric's class, it's very practical. So for me, at least, it was great. And as I graduated and I was looking for jobs, the job that I have kind of found me. I received an email from a friend. I was looking for NGOs again, and because when you graduate as a foreigner, you can work in the U.S. for a year before you have to go home unless someone sponsors you. So I thought it would be easier for me to get a job without someone having to sponsor me if it was an NGO or maybe a university or something that was a consultancy, short-term, World Bank, that kind of thing. And I got an email from a friend saying that PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, were looking for people with interest in international politics, international relations, who could speak Portuguese. So, perfect. Sent an application. I didn't know anyone at the place. They invited me for the first interview in February last year. So I started looking, obviously, before I graduated. And in May, like a week before I graduated, I was hired. So I went through a long process of interviews, 5 interviews in person in total, not to mention the CV and writing samples and all that. So it's a long process, and you should definitely start months beforehand. But I've been working there now for a year and a half. I started a week after my graduation, so I had 1 week vacation and that was it. And I'm at the Strategic Threat Management Department, which is a very generic name because we cover every sort of threat you can think of. So a lot of what I do in particular is based on anti-corruption. It's 3 antis. It's anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, and anti-terrorism. And I didn't know probably more than any of you know right now about the view. I learned it at the job. But there's a lot of there's a large regulatory framework, especially here in the U.S., with a lot of laws and a lot of compliance rules that companies have to fulfill in order to operate in here and abroad. So obviously, being from Brazil, I work mostly in Latin America. I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and mostly based here in DC, but with some trips. So I'm going to Brazil next week for a 3rd time. And I couldn't participate last year at this panel because I was in Brazil doing some anti-money laundering work. And Eli and I have some overlap in our duties, and I think it's mostly based on the FCPA, the anti-corruption part, so I'll leave that for him so that we don't repeat ourselves. And I'll just explain a little bit about what the anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism work entails. And those two, I think, are sort of grouped under threat finance, which is another generic term. But it basically means the way that rogue groups, maybe rogue regimes or rogue terrorist organization or drug cartel, the means that they use to finance themselves. And money laundering is just one of those, one of the mechanisms that I use, right? So they need basically to get money that is coming from some dirty activity, if it's money laundering, if it's drug trafficking or some other sort of trafficking, or they need to make that money appear to be clear, right? So what we do is to basically follow the international flows of money to understand how that is being disguised. And a lot of that have to do with the way corporations are organized, and what level of transparency do governments demand from companies in each place, and so how easy it is basically for you to hide who is the ultimate beneficial owner of a company, or where money is going and how companies get money and where are they sending their money. So it sounds very technical, and part of it is, but ultimately it's about transparency. So it's about the laws of transparency that each country has. And after a while in this job, you really get familiar with how much and to what extent each country demands or does not demand transparency from their companies and their operations. And anti-terrorism is almost the same, but the flow of money is the opposite. So it's not, for money laundering, you take dirty money and make it clean, right? For anti-terrorism, you take clean money and you make it dirty. You put it into a terrorist organization, but the origin of that money is from a legitimate business many times. So it's very hard to trace, because you have to know who's associated with who, and which companies, which are perfectly legit, and if you look at them, you're not going to see anything wrong with them. Who would they be that are sending money to these rogue groups or regimes? For example, the ISIS, that everybody hears about in the news recently. How do they finance themselves, right? Not only from dominating territory and charging taxes and controlling dams, but they also receive donations. And they even market the need for those donations in social media. So one of the things we do is monitor that, monitor social media, monitor groups, and monitor connections between people, between governments and companies to see how operations are being conducted and how can we stop it. A lot of, I work primarily with private companies, so my clients are private groups who are worried about either third parties that they work with, or how people that work for inside their companies, and if any of their money is being diverged to places where it shouldn't be going, we're talking about terrorism or money laundering. And they also worry about everyone that they have contact with, whether or not there is some sort of corruption going on that's going to reflect on them. Because here in the US, you're liable. Even if a third party commits an act of corruption or offer a bribe for someone in Brazil or in Chile or whatever, and your company has anything to do with that, like if it's a person acting on behalf of your company, say someone just expediting a visa for you, it doesn't matter if that expediter pays someone in that country, the company here is liable. So they have to make sure that they're working with the right parties everywhere, and that they have the right controls in place to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Basically, not only the US, but the UN and the OECD and the UK as well, they have very specific laws to try to encourage, convince companies not to conduct corruption, and also to make sure that these companies take responsibility for acts that are being conducted on their name. So it's not only that they go after politicians themselves, but also they try to convince the companies to implement controls to prevent that from happening. So that's what it's basically what I work with. And I'm now, after a year and a half, doing mostly program management, will be the equivalent, you might be used to that term. So I'm not writing the reports by myself, which I was when I started. I was doing the actual research. Now I'm mostly controlling the flow of reports and the flow of work, and make sure everybody's being attentive to their deadlines and reviewing the reports that are going to the client, and talking to our third parties if needed. And that took a year and a half. So it takes a year and a half for you to actually know what needs to be in each report and how to write it properly in the PwC language as well. So if you go into that kind of field, be prepared to be doing the nitty-gritty every day for many, many, many hours until they actually make you manage something. The classes that I thought that helped me the most were, like I said, primarily the political theory ones, because I felt like I liked it. So I would, and it's not because they're here, but I have classes with Professor Mahalian that were great, and with Eric as well, and with Professor Bromberg that I thought were very important to build a foundation. And even though I don't use every little political theory part of what I learned in my job, it helps you to have the bigger perspective and frame things correctly. And I would also recommend that you try to be research assistants for professors and programs that you like. That helped me a lot. And it looks great on your CV, especially if it's to do with some international experience. And to try to take classes outside of the program as well. After you do your mandatory ones, which are great, try to take classes at the government department and others that will add to your resume, especially the classic theory parts of it. And I don't want to be talking for too long, so I'll just stop here and answer questions if you have them. I hope you didn't fall asleep.
My name is Eli. I graduated from the program formally, I guess not this past August, but the one prior. And Andrea was mentioning the grunt work that people do when they first get to a company, and I'm neck deep in that grunt work right now. So I'm an analyst at Kroll. Kroll is a risk assessment firm. There's actually quite a bit of overlap between what Andrea does and what I do. I'm primarily conducting background investigations on corporations and their leadership all over the world. And I've kind of bounced around from team to team. I find myself right now on the IPO team. So these are companies that are about to go public. Their underwriters are very interested in understanding everything they can about a company before it goes public, before they sponsor that X, right? So I'm going through. So my reports involve regulatory, media findings, litigation. I'm pouring through litigation, and any sorts of outstanding judgments or liens that companies have pending. So these are very, very comprehensive reports. We're looking at primarily public data. We have a few proprietary databases, some of which I sometimes question the legality of what we have access to, because we don't have security clearances, but we have access to stuff. It's strange. But these are very comprehensive reports. The IPO team in particular will conduct a background investigation on a company and then its entire board of directors. So what ends up happening is, we generally have like 2 weeks to do these reports, but they end up being, 130, 160 pages long. And it's not just one person doing it, it's a team of people, which is a relief, right? But it's rather interesting work. I do appreciate the content of the work. And it's a great first job out of graduate school. And a little about my background, I did undergrad. I did a Fulbright in Turkey for a year, and then I came to Georgetown. So in terms of like hard skills, I had what grad school offered me. And grad school is kind of a process of professionalization. So I was working hard in the classroom, but I was also doing my best to procure internships, and those internships were crucial. But nonetheless, you don't need a full salaried job to get a full salaried job. I mean, what you really need to know is how to sell yourself, and something I would emphasize in terms of pursuing that first job, if some of you are looking for that first job, is to don't sell yourself short. Much of what you've done in grad school is actually rather impressive and rather important to a company looking to add value. So if you have done a project as an intern somewhere, and despite it being very simple or maybe rudimentary, if you can indicate that you used analytical skills to, in service of a deliverable, like that's just very, very helpful. And it took me a little while to realize that, because I would look at for example, a project I had done at the State Department when I was an intern there, and it seemed too simple to advertise. I wasn't like changing the world. I wasn't making a gigantic impact. but maybe I was nonetheless, compelling the office to look at an issue in a different way, and that's really important. So it's I think it's really important to know that and not to overlook what you've really done. And that's the advice I would give to someone who is or wasn't in my position, pursuing a job really for the first time. And what else? How the program prepared me. So to fall back on Eric and Andrea, writing is crucial, obviously. Research, writing, and analytical skills. Bringing you back, of course, to that cover letter and really demonstrating that you can conduct analysis in some capacity, even if it's just a very simple example. Put that in. It's very important. And then also, at least for Kroll, I'm not in the D&G field. I may circle back at some point, but the area expertise you get, if you're tailoring your program like I did to a specific region, I tailored my program to Turkey, having lived there and just being in love with that area of the world. You can use that knowledge to that knowledge helps you understand how business is done in a certain region, right? And that knowledge is really crucial for a job at a place like Kroll, or I'm sure PwC. Because if you're looking, for example, at, to use a report that I did, the energy sector in Edo State, Nigeria, the client wanted context, right? So we do a little bit of political risk, like some more macro analysis every now and then. The client wanted an assessment of the energy sector in Edo State, Nigeria. And having taken classes on corruption and political institutions in Nigeria, you know what to look for. You know exactly where to look, the types of adverse information you might find. And having that background is incredibly beneficial. It's very, very helpful. And then, actually 2 weeks ago, I was asked to do a write-up of the relationship between the AKP and Gulen in Turkey. And, I was the guy that they went to in the office because they know me as kind of the Turkey guy. And I was able to do a pretty solid write-up on that for the client. The client was very happy with that. Because while the client is really interested sometimes in the nitty-gritty and in the exact kind of maybe violations of compliance laws or regulatory laws or rules broken in any capacity really, sometimes those clients need a bigger picture. And I find those reports really interesting. If you find yourself at Kroll, the first few months will certainly be very much a learning process. If you can demonstrate to people that you're good at your job, that you're smart, you're going to get these jobs that are a little more exciting, these jobs that demand more of a macro approach to your reports. And that's a lot of fun. What brought me to Kroll was my interest originally in political risk. And I talked to a number of people in the field of political risk, people at Eurasia Group and people at a number of consulting firms in New York. And they had started at Kroll. So Kroll, the professor made it sound like, I really don't like my job. But my job has been...
I wonder how I got that impression.
But so I will be, I'm not here on behalf of Kroll, so I can be super transparent with you. The content of my job is rather interesting. I do like it. I've gotten a lot from it in the last year, and I just feel like what I'm getting from it is diminishing, and I'm going to look elsewhere. That's the reality. That's the reality, but that's what it is when you're young. You get your first job, whatever. So, what was I saying? Yes, political risk. That kind of brought me to Kroll. A lot of people had started out at Kroll. And for good reason. You really acquire a solid understanding of why that might be when you're doing the job. I feel like a lot of people go from Kroll into either they go work for our clients, which are big banks, Goldman or JP Morgan, or they'll go into governments. And the nature of our job is broadly transferable, right? Like, we do a lot of what the Treasury does, or what people at State do, or what people at the FBI or the CIA would do. because it's investigations, right? It's these in-depth investigations. We're just doing it for the private sector. We're not investigating, terrorist groups or extremist groups in the way that the government might be. So I hope that kind of gives you just like a general sense of what I do, and also what you might want to emphasize in pursuance of a job at a place like Kroll. And I look forward also to your questions.
Well, thanks very much. Really appreciate your exposition. I think it's obvious, but I think one of the common threads is really the importance of identifying your assets, identifying your weaknesses, strengthening your weaknesses, and deploying your assets, so that you can blend together local knowledge, more conceptual general knowledge, interest in practical affairs, but also balancing it off in terms of being able to analytically express what you're thinking and what you're proposing. And so you don't need to hear from me. Let me turn the floor over to you. Why don't you identify yourself and go away and fire away. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Julia Clemens. I'm actually not a student at Georgetown at all. University of Chicago a couple of years ago for college, and then I've lived in Egypt and done a couple of jobs in nonprofits. Question, I think mostly for the ambassador. One thing that I'm still grappling with in the understanding the field of democracy promotion is that any democracy inherently has to be locally supported by that country, right? And then my experience living in Egypt for a year, and this may be transferable to other countries in the region, I don't know about globally, is that the closer that an Egyptian is to, the more closely they work with other countries, the local perception of that person tends to be that they're not Egyptian enough or that they're a sellout or something. Is that a challenge that has emerged in your work? I'm still grappling with how that works and how that affects what my role would be as an American to do that kind of work. How does that play out?
That can depend on the culture and where you are. In Egypt, I think it's because of the history, and then the recent history in particular with the revolution and the so-called Arab awakening, and then the reaction, and in a society that's closed in many respects, that can be true, not just in Egypt, but throughout the Middle East. You go to the Emirates and some of these other places, Qatar, there's a lot of suspicion about people who want to work in this field. And, look what the Egyptians did. They cracked down on the NDI people and the IRI people over there because they're, suspicious of what democracy really means for them. And then there are some people, of course, who don't want democracy, and some of those people are back in power now. But remember, there's one thing I would urge you to sort of keep in mind when we're talking about democracy and governance at the start. It's great you've got this program here at Georgetown that we're really paying attention to these sets of issues from in a more formal way and able to study them. But, democracy and governance issues really, you can argue, came into their own with Woodrow Wilson. You can also tag Teddy Roosevelt with some of it, but promoting democracy and good governance, by the U.S. government at least, is not a new thing. It's something we've done throughout since we became a world power, which most internationalist political scientists would say came after the Spanish-American War. And Dr. Reed Dulles, I think, wrote the book America's Rise to World Power, which if you haven't read, I urge you to read. But so since that time, TR, Wilson in particular, FDR, there's, the U.S. has a vocation we have always felt to promote democracy around the world, because we believe that if we have a democratic government to deal with, we have more common ground, there's more understanding, less conflict, more peace, less war. So, democracy, and along with democracy comes good governance. I mean, there are plenty of countries that have democracy but are not well governed. Okay, you can name them. There are all sorts of shades on on the scale. There are people who have used, especially lately we've seen in the Western Hemisphere, they've used democratic systems for authoritarian ends. They've come to power using the democratic system. Chavez in Venezuela comes to mind, but then they've consistently eroded, the both the substance and the functional part of democracy for their own singular ends. So, you've seen now the new president in Indonesia, very interesting, came, out from the people and not from the traditional power structure in Indonesia. So, there's a whole, you talk about, and I'm sure that you're studying these things, talk about democracy and governance, it's something the U.S. has promoted, traditionally, especially, as I say, since the beginning of the 20th century, when we felt we had the strength to do it overseas, and we weren't so tied to Washington's dictum and his farewell address. Does that make sense?
Yes. Can I ask you to describe a little bit
Sure.
how your work with ISIS is affected by the situation that I described?
Well, the work I'm doing in Syria now, it's
You're anti-ISIS, obviously.
yeah, it's funded by the State Department. It's a MEPI grant, in fact, a Middle East Institute at State, and what we're trying to do is teach the Syrian political opposition something about democracy and governance. What is a functioning democracy? How do you put it together? And once you put it together, how do you govern it? How do you keep it together? For example, in constructing the government, the notion of a civilian minister of defense was totally alien to them. Several people stood up and said, well, we can't do that. And I said, why? Well, the answer was, we've never had a civilian minister of defense in Syria. We can't do that. It has to be a military man. And so then we got into, signal relations and, how you could govern that way, how you could have a civilian minister of defense. Maybe he's an ex-general who's committed to the new democracy, but would like to join the government and, work as for the democratic goals. The second part of what we're doing, that was last year. This year we've been working with with senior military commanders of the Free Syrian Army, bringing them out of Syria, out of their conflict zones, little by little, because they need strength on the ground, and to talk to them about, because of course they're a vital component of the Syrian opposition, political opposition, and the military opposition, which is fighting on the ground. More about civilian-military relations and also a civilian structure for a Ministry of Defense if they ever get that far. So this is all trying to prepare them for, in fact, the project is called the Day After Project. It's trying to prepare them for the day after Assad, when they may have to take power and actually make a democracy work. Now, in the group, I will say everyone is committed to the notion of a pluralistic democracy, all along ethnic lines, along religious lines, along sectarian lines, along all lines. It's a very mixed group, and as you know, Syria has a particularly complex makeup, religiously, ethnically, politically. They have a little bit of everything, but they all agree on that. The question is, how do you put this in practice? And none of them agree, still don't, and they have a very hard time grappling with some of the concepts because they've never lived in a democracy. They don't know what it is, and they don't know how to put it together and make it work. So they could use some of you guys out there if they ever come to power.
Eric, did you have
Yeah, I just want to use this as an excuse to make a general comment. One of the sort of central tenets of American democracy promotion in the last 25 years has been to try to not have it be just promoting American institutions and the American view of the world. And one of the reasons that it has made a contribution in a lot of places is because we've emphasized kind of the universal nature of democratic values. And most of the world has signed on to that in a lot of ways. UN resolutions and multilateral organizations and funding and support, including not only democracy promotion as a high-level idea, but as development assistance, you get funding from not only lots of intergovernmental organizations, but from all over Europe, and from Japan, and from Australia, and, multilateral organizations in the Western Hemisphere, etc. Now, the issues that you raise in Egypt have always been difficult. Those have always been there in different ways. certainly before the end of the Cold War, a lot of people in the world saw the world through that lens, and there was suspicion of American motives in operating in the world. And a lot of the successes of American democracy assistance were post-Cold War, were in that period after the Cold War, when there was, a little bit more willingness in more places to kind of not dismiss what you had to say immediately because you happened to be from the United States. If you were there, with people from Europe and from other developing democracies, so much the better. But there was a period of time where most of the world was kind of signed on to the idea of democracy as being a universal idea, and we weren't talking about our institutions, which are all messed up. We were talking about our values, which are not, and are shared. And unfortunately, we've regressed a lot since the Iraq misadventure and sort of all the things that have happened in the last 10 years or so. In that sort of, there's parts of the world that have kind of, their suspicion of American motives has gone up. We still try to internationalize what we're doing. And by we, I mean the U.S. government, U.S. organizations, and indeed the global community of organizations that are in this field. We've tried to continue to internationalize it, but the resistance and the suspicions have gone up, and it does depend on the country. And I think certainly in the OSCE world, where Russia is influential, Russian objections to democracy assistance, democracy promotion, and to sort of the values that we're espousing have substantially hampered effectiveness in the last years. So where there's a period of time where Russia was kind of cooperating with the United States government and U.S. organizations, that's changed a lot. And it is very, and beyond that, it's country specific. So there's a very healthy way of dealing with the outside world in Indonesia when I was there, starting when the transition began in the late '90s, where there was kind of the right, willingness to listen to comparative models and technical advice, but not sort of overly be directed by it and not be dependent on the international community or international assistance or something. Whereas in Egypt, the suspicion is much greater, and we work in Egypt, so we deal with that on a day-to-day basis. So that it does vary a lot, but I would say it's become harder to do our work in the last years than it was for say, the period of the 90s. Can I also, I want to mention I've got 3 colleagues in the back of the room that are alums of the program and are presently my colleagues, Liza Prendergast, Josh Linden, and Claire Robertson, so they all can speak directly to the kind of, the same kind of issues that my colleagues have covered.
All right. Very good. Other questions, thoughts?
I have a question for Mr. Jornlund, based on the comment you made about the waning funding in democracy and governance studies that's occurring. I was at the Does Democracy Matter conference today over at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and one issue that came up repeatedly was the tension between promoting democracy abroad and our image of domestic democracy, and how that's affecting negatively our ability to effectively promote democracy abroad. And so I guess what I'm curious about, and I asked the question there and at the conference, and they didn't seem willing to give a good answer to it, and maybe there isn't one, but is there any work in the field of democracy promotion that looks at balancing in sort of a two-way channel how we promote democracy abroad and how we do it at home? So for example, making the American public aware of foreign policy efforts to promote democracy and why it's important, and using that to make them understand that we have to improve democracy at home in order to do it abroad, and why it's sort of a balance. You can't have one and not the other.
I think
That's what I'm saying.
one of the things that's really interesting is that there is now this profession of democracy assistance, or however you want to define it. There's a community of individuals and organizations that have been involved in this effort for some period of time, and we've been totally focused on the world, and we haven't focused on the U.S. So part of the answer when we're overseas, we always say, we're not saying you have to have a dysfunctional Congress like we do. We're not saying you have to, have a completely unbalanced way of electing your upper house of parliament that gives huge powers to the minority to prevent the majority from ever accomplishing anything, or adopting our ridiculously decentralized election administration system, or whatever. We're not defending those institutions. So that's part of what we try to do. We say, but there's a lot you can learn from our experience and from the experience of everyone in the world. But the other piece about it that's interesting is that, that your question raises, is that we haven't, as our community, we learned a lot over time in talking about the political arrangements, the institutional arrangements, and the politics of many other countries. We haven't tended to sort of point that back at the U.S. We've tried to explain how the fact that the U.S. Presidential election in 2000 completely became a debacle, and was decided by a 5-4 ideological decision of the Supreme Court, doesn't mean that we can't help give good advice on how to organize elections. But it would be, I think it would be something that that our community should try to do, which is inform the debate in the U.S., which is a very high level debate as well as a practical. I mean, it's partly things like the Electoral Assistance Commission, which came out of the 2000 experience to try to make election administration more effective in the U.S. But it's also a kind of high-level political values, constitutional reform discussion. And I think even today, Larry Diamond said that in his talk, and he's made that point before, that we do need to worry about political institutions in the U.S. and whether we have something to say about the need for reform in the U.S. But we don't feel like it hampers our ability to give advice.
Could I add something to that?
Sure, please.
I'd caution you a little bit on that connection. The United States still has tremendous credibility as a democracy abroad, and for what we do as a nation and how we do it. I will tell you that what do the Syrians run up and say to me every other day? We want what you've got. We want that. Yes, we understand that your institutions are perfect. Democratic institutions aren't perfect. And they don't always work. There are plenty of other examples in our history when Congress frustrated presidents. This isn't the only one. This is only the latest one. But we managed to work around those things. What were the people who brought the revolution to the end of the streets in Egypt saying when the revolution was at its high point? We want what you've got. That's what they were telling journalists and everybody who would listen to them. We want what America has. We want freedom. We want democracy. We understand democracy is not perfect. We're not totally uninformed on that. And I'll challenge you to go around the world, talk to people about that issue, and you'll find that we still have tremendous credibility. Not only the notion of democracy and the concept of it, but our institutions. Yes, there are problems, there are flaws, there are things that need to be fixed, but by and large, our institutions still work. It's the one great strength of American democracy. And you'll have people, I've had people from when I was a junior officer in Panama to Chile, and you name it, to say, we're just amazed at how, you can have an election and a new president takes, one guy goes out and the other guy comes in and he gives a speech and everything keeps going. And, you don't have, they're not challenged, the military's not bringing out tanks, how do you do it? How do you do it? We do it because our institutions are strong. We have the strongest institutions of any democracy in the world, bar none. We've also been at it longer, and we have more credibility at it than anybody in the EU or anywhere else. So I caution you a little bit on that. You'll find people, by and large, around the world still greatly admire the United States for not just who we are, not just democracy as an idea, and it is, but how we do it, and the fact that our institutions, excuse me, are strong and they work. Now, do they need fixing here and there? Do we need to do some things? Yes, but that's always been the case. I mean, look at what FDR faced, and in many other times in history. Look at the hostile Congress that Abraham Lincoln faced. I mean, it was absolutely openly hostile. So this is not new. It's just the latest iteration, and it was one of the things. Certainly, when I was in Guatemala, one of the things we were striving to do, as we supported a fledgling democracy there, was to help them build their institutions. That's what dragged them down. It drags so many countries down. They don't have functioning democratic institutions that work, and therefore it's very hard for them, to move forward. If you go to, many countries, and I'm thinking of a few in Central America, but it goes well beyond that. When you scratch the surface, you have a good government, you have a president, he has his ministers and his team, and you go to a ministry, and you can deal with a minister and get something done. But the minute you drop below the ministerial level, there's nothing there. You have some vice ministers, yes, one or two may be okay, but there's no permanent bureaucracy, there's no civil service to support the Minister of Trade or to support the Minister of Foreign Affairs. A few more in Foreign Affairs because there are some professional diplomats in most countries, but the institutions are weak. They don't have the structure, they don't have the personnel, they don't have prepared people like you who are, you know, coming out of graduate schools, out of programs and go to work for government and make their institutions work. So, you know, it's not as dire a, you know, picture out there as you and I would say, yeah, people look back and say, well, yeah, you guys are kind of crazy. Well, the world has thought we were kind of crazy, you know, for a long time. But they don't necessarily connect it to the delegitimization of our institutions or the lack of credibility of our democracy. I think that's a view that's, you know, not a majority view.
Let me piggyback,
That's my take.
if I may, on to some of these ideas. And particularly taking note of the fact that there are a fair number of you that have just started the program